This is A New Angle, a show about cool people doing awesome things in and around Montana. I'm your host, Justin Angle. This show is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Hey folks, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. Today is our May edition of Incentives and Instincts, a recurring series in which I speak with economist and friend Bryce Ward about some of the broader issues facing our society. Bryce, how are you today?
It's good. It's spring finally.
Yeah, it is. It does feel like spring. So it's good to see you here in the studio. And today we're going to try to tackle social media. What is it doing to us? And can we and our democracy survive it? So I know you and I are both fans of NYU psychologist Jonathan Haidt's work. He was sounding the alarm early on social media and the connection between it and teen depression, suicide, anxiety. You know, this was 7-8 years ago. Many folks were dismissing those claims as sort of ahead of the evidence. Well, now he and his colleagues have accumulated quite a bit of evidence that's connecting, particularly Instagram, with depression, anxiety, and suicide ideation and suicide action among teenage girls in particular. Yeah, how do you feel about the Haidt work in general and this body of work trying to link social media to some bad outcomes with mental health?
Look, it's a hard thing to ultimately establish causality for. We know the trends, so the description is terrifying, right? That's basically starting in 2009, teenage mental health statistics, basically in any one you want to pick, suddenly started spiking up, particularly for girls.
Right.
And they are up massively. Now, the suicide stuff, it's just reversing a downward trend, right? So we're basically back where we were when we were in high school.
Right.
But things
were getting better for a period of time.
But for 20 years, they had been collapsing. And so suddenly, 2009, roughly, everything starts reversing and, depression, suicide ideation, suicide attempts are all up enormously, terrifyingly, I think is the way to think about it. And, we're at now, I think it's like 40% of adolescent girls are reporting persistent feelings of anxiety and depression.
And we're seeing similar trends on campuses across different student cohorts. Some people will say, well, hey, this is just a question of measurement. If you're asking people over and over again, are you feeling depressed? Are you feeling anxious? You're going to get more yeses to that question. But we're also seeing this in hard measures, people taking their own lives.
And that's so the other thing that people push back on was, it's just now we're more comfortable talking about it.
Yeah.
Right. Which is always a bit bogus. I mean, maybe not the depression ones because we didn't ask those questions, but certainly have you ever thought about suicide? Was a question that I took. I took the youth high school, whatever the CDC survey is. I remember taking it when I was a sophomore.
Yeah.
That data goes back to the early 90s when I was in school. And, we were asking these questions then, and people were saying, yes, I have thought about suicide and I have made a plan to commit suicide. So that part, that decline was real. And so I never really bought into it's just we're more comfortable. There may be a little bit of that. But yeah, the actual emergency room statistics are what's spiking along with all of this, right? So with the fact that we're seeing more adolescents in emergency rooms having, with some sort of self-harm, this is real. Whatever you want to talk about, this is a real problem. These are real trends that we need to start, understand, and then say, okay, well, what are we going to try and do to reverse this?
Right. And so you can also ask the question, is this pandemic related? Is it sort of exacerbated in the last 2 years? We've certainly seen some exacerbation, but these trends started long before pandemic. So you can kind of dismiss the pandemic as a single cause. It maybe is a catalyst of a sort.
Or it may have exacerbated,
right.
Or accelerated whatever was going on. But the reality is that these trends were going on long before our little friend, the coronavirus, started spreading around.
Our little friend. Yeah. So what do we know about mechanism? Because that's one thing that I think was a common critique of this body of research. It was saying, correlation is not causation. How are we trying to establish causation?
Well, obviously, the way we really want to establish causation is through experiment.
Right.
And we actually now have a couple of experiments. A friend of mine from graduate school, a guy named Matthew Jenskow, who's at Stanford, he has 2 papers now where we have experimental evidence, not necessarily focused on teen girls, but the first was him and a group of colleagues in 2018 in the weeks before the 2018 election, they paid people to deactivate their Facebook accounts randomly.
Okay.
Right. And what did we learn? Well, we learned that, your subjective well-being report went up, your polarization went down, your knowledge of the news went down, and there was some other evidence that basically that people were addicted to this. And then a newer paper with a guy named Hunt Alcott on digital addiction, which was about Facebook, that they put an app on people's phones that put a hard limit on how much time you could spend on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, your browser, and then basically said, look, we'll pay you for every minute that you reduce.
Right.
And again, they found that when you paid people spent a lot less time. And then when you took the money away, they kept spending less time. And, they followed up for 6 weeks after the initial experimental period, and people continued to reduce it. And then, that combined with some other evidence, basically what they figured out was about a third of the time that people spend on their phones in those kinds of apps is due to self-control problems.
Right.
They don't want to do it, but they're addicted to it, or, whatever. The paper's called Digital Addiction. People can go check it out. But so we know that it's addictive. We know that it was designed to be addictive.
And that addiction piece, though, let's pause on that for a moment, because that's kind of a controversial term in many ways. I mean, there is a neuropsychologist at Columbia, Dr. Carl Hart, who does work on actual drugs, where he pays crack addicts or cocaine addicts to stop using cocaine. And he says, because I can find the inflection point where they say, I'd rather have the dollar or however many dollars versus another dose, is evidence that the addiction is not this chemical mechanism that we necessarily think it is. So how we sort of frame addiction in this conversation is probably going to be a little bit loose in those terms.
Yeah. So I think we'll just use the language they use, which is self-control problems, right? It's something, it's not that I'm like, this is clearly the best use of these minutes. It's, I'm here because something has put me here, and when I'm given the opportunity to try and restrict it, I do.
Yeah. So there's this self-control problem. We are inclined to use more of this thing, and we'll get into the why of that in a moment, but let's talk about the why does it hurt us?
So I think there's a couple of different hypotheses. So the first hypothesis is particularly the posting of pictures of yourself. But even I actually think, whether it's pictures or not, a post is putting yourself out there.
It is.
And if you don't get what you expect in terms of engagement, it feels bad, right? And you start tracking, how many people are looking at this, because there are all these little ways that you can look at the statistics on all your various posts, and and then you start spending a whole bunch of time not just thinking about the response to the post, but planning the post. And, so you're just consuming a lot of your attention in this area, which
you're investing yourself.
You're investing yourself in something, and it's very easy not to get the feedback that you want out of it, right? So I think that's we'll call that the direct.
Well, the feedback you want is 100% affirmation.
Yeah.
Like, you're the greatest, you're beautiful, all this positive affirmation. There's no such thing as enough likes.
That's right.
Right? There's no such thing as enough positive
enough followers,
comments.
Enough friends, whatever it is.
Absolutely.
It's just you're just kind of, let me get some more, and let me look at it some more. And another direct effect of social media, which again I don't know about evidence for, other than I've got plenty of anecdotal evidence from people who they don't like the social comparison.
Yeah.
We're not good at actually evaluating our own lives, but I have some notion of my average. And what people put on social media is their best.
And we think of it as their life.
Yeah. And I have this, at least for some people that have told me that this is why they quit, was they couldn't, even though they knew it, they couldn't keep from feeling less than because of how great everybody else looked.
Yeah. And so Haidt makes the claim, and others do too, that this is particularly pernicious with young girls who are sort of entering puberty and going through this psychological and physical change, and to be putting images of themselves out in public that get rated and reviewed and commented back on, as we just discussed, is particularly dangerous to this group.
And just think about our own pre-internet high school experience.
Oh, yeah.
Right? You know, like, oh man, they had the nicer car, or they had, they just, they had nicer clothes or whatever. Now I can see everything that you want to put, like the party that you went to.
All of it.
I might have known that there was a party, but I didn't look at any pictures of it.
I didn't feel like I missed out
Right?
after seeing all these photos.
I just knew there was a party at so-and-so's house and I didn't go. Like whatever, like it didn't bother me because I wasn't like, oh wait, so-and-so was there or this person was there. Or, I didn't know where people went on vacation unless you were my close friend. Like, so there's just all that kind of stuff. These kind of the emotions that are tied to, 'cause we're social creatures. We want to compare ourselves.
Yes.
And, this is just social comparison on steroids. And now somebody from your high school isn't just going to be the cool kid in high school. They could be the cool kid in the world, right? They're an influencer and they're like getting all this stuff. And like, yeah, that's real power in a world where the currency is status.
That's a job description that younger people want these days. They say, I want to become a social media influencer.
Yeah.
Which
and
it can be a path to making millions of dollars.
Yeah. I mean, there were kids that could be actors or whatever it was when we were kids. But like where I was from, I don't think anybody was, quote, famous.
Yeah. And in some ways, this is a good thing. Like it's democratizing in a way. Like if you don't have the resources to like hire a fancy acting coach and get yourself to New York or LA, like
we can view that as benefit, but it's coming at a big cost.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And that's where we have to struggle, right? Is it worth it for some small number of people to be able to become rich? Is that worth the big spike in depression, anxiety, suicide? It seems like there's an obvious answer, which is that the cost to adolescence is probably not worth the fact that you can become famous.
Right.
And it's also worth, moving from the direct effects of social media bucket to there's also, the other part of this is the indirect effects.
Right.
Which is, what does this crowd out? All these hours that I'm spending on this thing is coming at a cost.
And let's just sort of quote some of these hours. Like Facebook, weekly average use is about 16 hours. Instagram, 8 hours. TikTok, 26 hours is average weekly use for the TikToker. So people are allocating huge portions of their life to this. And as you said, what sort of things is this crowding out?
Yeah, and that's the part that they're on it, right? Again, this does not account for the time that you're spent thinking about what you're going to put on it. Or, or the feelings that come after you have gotten off of it. Mm-hmm. There's lots of other stuff that you should be doing as a teenager.
Get outside.
Go interact with humans.
Read a book.
Right? Like
all those
we know
things.
that friends is literally one of the most important things that you can have in your life. Right?
That is clear.
Health, wealth, happiness. If you're saying what is it that generates some of the biggest effects? I mean, I was reading a book recently by this guy named Robin Dunbar. But, in the preamble, he says, well, why do we care about this? He cites this study, which basically is like having a good social framework in terms of its effect on your health is equivalent to quitting smoking.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
I mean, friends are huge.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If, my own research on this is, we're looking at time use data, where we say people, okay, well, what were you doing and how did it make you feel? Right? And you say, well, what is the thing that causes the biggest increase in how much you say you feel good? Mm-hmm. It's socializing. It's time with friends and family.
We'll be back to my conversation with Bryce Ward after this short break.
A New Angle is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and UM's College of Business. Access to capital, broadband, and education are 3 ingredients any community needs for success.
I'm Larry Summers, Harvard President Emeritus and former Treasury Secretary. You're listening to A New Angle.
Welcome back to A New Angle. I'm speaking with Bryce Ward about the consequences of social media.
And I think as we're emerging from pandemic, and hopefully that continues, we're all sort of living through that reality of being in person in our interactions, being able to socialize or converse or teach a class without a mask on and with the other person without having a mask on when that's safe. I mean, it has been liberating in so many ways. And I can feel the sort of scaffolding of mental health kind of coming back into play in my own mind. And across society, we have to be experiencing that as well.
Well, hopefully we start doing more of it. But again, the problem with social media is it makes me feel some like simulation of social connection.
Right.
At a ridiculously low cost, right? Because normally to interact with people is work, right? It takes work, right? I got to get dressed. I got to leave my house. Like, I got to like clean up. Like I got to be presentable.
Right.
I got to drive somewhere or walk somewhere or travel somewhere.
It's really hard.
And
that's a very kind of, to draw from Stoicism a little bit, it'd be interesting, or I think a useful framework for thinking about social media for the listener and for us is like, what is it stealing? Like you're paying for this with your life. You're allocating time that you can't get back to this thing. What is that crowding out?
It's crowding your attention, right? In fact, that's what the digital addiction paper, like, when they were looked at social subjective well-being kind of stuff, the thing that moved the most was a measure of kind of attention, right? That's what you were giving up. That's what you get back when you don't put your time into social media is you get attention to other stuff. And, those are scarce. Effort, motivation, attention are scarce commodities in your life. Right. And, you should be thinking about how you want to allocate them just as you would your bank account. So Derek Thompson refers to social media as attention alcohol.
Yeah.
And, I think that's a really nice metaphor for what it is, it's fine for a lot of people. It's totally okay to do it in some form of moderation. But like for some people, it really does. It hijacks your attention. And unlike alcohol, it's new. We've had alcohol forever.
Yeah, and it's not regulated.
We don't have a language around it.
There's a norm that you can do it everywhere all the time, pretty much, like in the aisle at the grocery store.
We haven't built the infrastructure to say, okay, we understand the trade-offs, and we're going to regulate this in this way, and we're going to have these norms, and and that's why it's particularly dangerous for younger people. But I think another part of why we're seeing this trend in adolescent mental health outcome is because of how we're parenting our kids, right? The accommodative helicopter, bulldozer, snowplow, whatever we want to call it, parenting, it's fundamentally about, I don't want my child to ever feel bad. And I think what we are learning increasingly with things like cognitive behavioral therapy or exposure therapy or whatever it is that those work really well, right? The evidence base just keeps growing, right? And so a part of what we think of as childhood historically was just this, well-developed form of, you get this much stress at this age and you get this stress and you just kind of have to you start learning. And look, it's not perfect, right? The modern equivalent of this is we talk about allergies, right? And, peanut allergies in particular, we have a lot of evidence for, which is part of the problem we have with peanut allergies is because we started treating peanut allergies, right?
Take away the peanuts.
Take away the peanuts.
Peanut allergy.
And then, we learned that, actually, if you just keep exposing kids, then they'll typically, for the most part, they'll get better.
Right.
But there's some that don't. And, our children are kind of the same way, right? They need to be doing developmentally appropriate risk-taking so that they're able to handle certain stressors.
Yeah, that's what life's about, stress and adaptation. And in many ways, this framework that a neurobiologist, Anna Lemke, has put out in her recent book, what's it called, Dopamine Nation?
Yeah, Dopamine Nation.
Explain that framework, because it sort of provides an elegant way for understanding what's going on in our brains with regard to pleasure and pain.
So, basically she views dopamine as this key chemical, right? It's the key motivator.
Yeah.
Right? And it evolved over the course of millennia in humans as a way to get us to, we did something, we felt good. Whatever, we ate some fruit, right?
Yeah.
Well, that was really good. I should keep walking now and go find some more.
Sure, because you have to put the effort in to go finding the more fruit.
Right? So dopamine is this wonderful motivation system in a world of scarcity.
That we had millions of years to develop and adapt to.
Yeah, and we lived in scarcity.
Exactly.
Real scarcity, right? And so, and we live in real scarcity until relatively recently, right? And it's not to say that I'm an economist. There's still plenty of scarcity, right?
Yeah.
I study scarcity. That's what I do. But we have relative abundance. The dopamine in our brains, that response, the way that she describes it as like this teeter-totter, right? I get a hit of dopamine, I feel good. But the brain, because it wants to keep you motivated to go get the things that you need to survive, starts immediately trying to push back on the teeter-totter. It wants you to feel some sort of pain.
so that you go
so
solve
that
the problem
you go
with
solve the
dopamine.
problem, right?
Okay.
And it used to be that would, that took time and effort. And so like the brain didn't have to work very hard to push back.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. But like I just ate some candy, right? And there's, you'll notice this, most people will notice this, which is I ate some candy. I should go get some more candy.
Yeah.
Right. And so I just get up off the couch and walk back to the candy area and get another handful of M&Ms.
But the interesting inflection point is it's not that the candy makes us feel good and I want more of that. It is that the absence of candy makes me feel bad. In order to avoid feeling bad, I go get more candy.
That's right.
So you're never actually increasing your well-being. You're avoiding the lack of well-being in many ways.
And that's the challenge, right? Is that, what I took from Dopamine Nation is social media is a different form of abundance, right?
Yeah,
And she talks about it as look, for some people, that is what gives them hits of dopamine, and it's immediate.
And a lot of it's non-conscious.
It's
just
non-conscious,
right there.
it's
I
just
get
right
it on
there.
my phone. It's autopilot.
We have to develop language around it. We have to develop habit around it. We have to learn how to manage our dopamine in a world of relative abundance.
Right.
When I can find a way to satisfy that craving that my brain is saying, oh, that would feel good, right? Without having to do much work, right?
Yeah.
And that's the challenge we have with living with abundance and what's new right now. I mean, so we've had dopamine issues with sugar and alcohol and drugs for
ages.
for a long time. We're now understanding it better, and hopefully that will lead to better treatments for those types of addictions. But what we have now, we have made information and entertainment as abundant as possible. Essentially, we have this media ecosystem, and it's not just social media, right? The streaming, and going back to those indirect effects, what are we giving up, right? We've made it so easy. I don't know about you, but do you remember like high school and college spending hours walking around the video store?
Oh, yeah.
Trying to find a movie.
Right.
Now, sometimes that happens when I have I have like literally the entire library of movies and television to watch. And I'm like, well, which should I find? But like, for the most part, it's like my head thinks it. Oh, I should watch X.
Sure.
Boop.
Or Netflix has created it before you even knew you needed
Yeah,
it. And you just take their recommendation and you go with it.
And it's just there. And like, it's like, well, why would I don't need to, this is great. Like, and some part of it is great. But like in terms of what are we giving up in terms of actual relationships with other humans?
Yeah. What is it stealing from us?
There's real cost in terms of just what kind of relationships we're having and, what are we doing with our lives and what are we getting out of it? And, I think we have to, so hopefully the solution is what Lemke is suggesting in Dopamine Nation, which is we have to learn how to manage this teeter-totter that she describes of, essentially what she describes is, you get the good stuff and then your brain pushes what she calls gremlins on the other side. And the more you keep pushing, the more gremlins it does.
Gremlins are out there.
And the more and those gremlins start to cause chronic pain, maybe anxiety, maybe depression, maybe all of these things that we're seeing in such high rates is because we have solved some of what we thought of as problems. Right? We solve scarcity problems, which as economists, that's the whole thing. We want to solve scarcity problems, only to discover that our brains are hardwired for scarcity. We've seen this obviously in economic development forever, right? It's like, oh, we'll solve this problem by like building this thing. And then it's like, well, that creates this problem. Oh, we're going to be, this just constant engineering that we have to keep going through it's a challenge. And, but hopefully getting to this part of our brains and starting to understand it will give us new tools, new language, new norms. It'll take some time, which will allow us to live with the abundance in ways that aren't making us sad, unhappy, suicidal, whatever, all these kinds of things that are real problems.
As we close, though, Bryce, I would like to leave listeners with 2 recommendations for how to address this problem in yourself. If some of the things we've talked about resonates with you, 2 things that have worked well for me are, Montana's a big state with a lot of areas that don't have connectivity. Get out into those areas. This is May, and the weather's getting better. The access to the high country is getting better. Get out there. Disconnect yourself with intention. Leave the phone behind. The other thing that I do is I set my phone to grayscale. Try that for a week. Set your phone to grayscale. You can do it in the iPhone. I will publish a link to how to do that in the show notes. But set your phone to grayscale. Commit to it for a week. Turn back the color. And you'll understand how your brain responds to the stimulus. You'll feel it so dramatically that you might be compelled to stick with the grayscale because you'll notice what the color and the interaction of the interface is doing to you. Any recommendations you have?
Well, there are various apps which will allow you to try and self-commit
Yeah,
to
that's right.
less time. The first recommendation, which is what I have done, which is you remove all of it from your phone.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it.
Like put barriers between you and the dopamine hit. At least make you go get your computer.
Just like the walk to the next banana tree.
That's right. And and then the other thing, which is, this is broader, what Lemke describes is what she did with her kids was she did a lot of what she called forced marches, right? So, I think this is why the evidence on exercise is so compelling on why it's so good for us in terms of our mental health and well-being is you're you're basically saying, oh, I'm pushing on the other side. I'm making myself feel the pain. And then your brain is doing the exact reverse. It's putting the gremlins on the pleasure side. And it's a way of trying to help, do things that will help you modulate. Don't just seek pleasure. Yeah, you've got to find the balance. So figure out what helps you find the balance and, try and do that.
I refer to it as mandatory fun with my kids. So go out and have some mandatory fun.
Yeah.
They might not see it quite that way, but that's the way I frame it. Anyway, Bryce, always fun to reconnect. And I look forward to continuing this conversation in our next installment. And until then, be well.
All right. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks for listening to A New Angle. We really appreciate it. And we're coming to you from Studio 49, a generous gift from University of Montana alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. A New Angle is presented by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. With additional support from Consolidated Electrical Distributors, Drum Coffee, and Montana Public Radio. AJ Williams is our producer. BTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks made our music. Editing by Nick Mott, and Jeff Meese is our master of all things sound. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.